Kevin Warsh, the man now running the Federal Reserve, has inherited a debt pile creeping toward $40 trillion, and many people think he has some sort of a grand plan to inflate it all away. The real story, though, is rather more dangerous than money printing, because Warsh is completely trapped by that number, and the corner he's been backed into could break the economy whichever way he turns. And those cheering for some grand inflation scheme have it backwards. The debt has already unleashed itself, and the man who inherited it has no clear way out. So, today we break down how America built a $39 trillion debt mountain, why every move Warsh can now make costs him dearly one way or the other, and why the squeeze lands squarely on the mortgages, savings, and pensions of people like you. My name is Nick, and this is the Finance Bureau. As of late June 2026, the US national debt sat at roughly $39.3 trillion, and the speed of that climb is just as worrying as the figure itself. Back in 2015, the debt was around $18 trillion. By early 2022, it had crossed $30 trillion. It hit $38 trillion just last October, and now it's knocking on the door of $40 trillion. America, in other words, added more debt in the last decade than it did in the 2 previous centuries combined, and it isn't slowing down. The national debt is currently growing at roughly $4.7 billion a day, about $195 million every hour around the clock. Gross debt now sits near 123% of everything the entire US economy produces in a year. And the last time America carried a debt burden like this was in the aftermath of the Second World War. Only back then, there was a post-war boom waiting to grow the country out of it. Now, a big number on its own is just a headline. What turns it into a trap is the interest. In the 2025 fiscal year, the US government spent around $970 billion on net interest, purely servicing debt it already owed. And the Congressional Budget Office expects that figure to cross $1 trillion for the first time in the nation's history in fiscal year 2026. Since fiscal year 2024, again for the first time ever, America has been paying more in interest on its debt than it spends on its entire military. And that gap has only widened since. Interest has now climbed past defense to become the 3rd largest line item in the whole entire federal budget, behind only Social Security and Medicare. Not schools, not roads, not the armed forces, but money spent on nothing more than the privilege of having borrowed money in the past. That is the reality Warsh has walked into, a $39 trillion pile growing by the hour with an interest bill that already dwarfs the entire defense budget. Warsh has one job when inflation runs hot, which is to raise interest rates and cool the economy down, and inflation is indeed running hot. Headline CPI came in at 4.2% year-on-year in May, the fastest pace in 3 years, driven largely by the energy shock from the US-Iran conflict that erupted back in February, while the Fed's own preferred measure, PCE, is sitting at 4.1%, more than double the 2% target. So, the textbook says, hike. The trouble is that every time Warsh raises rates, he raises the cost of that $39 trillion debt pile. And this is where the so-called rollover wall comes in. Because debt isn't a one-time bill, it has to be constantly refinanced as old bonds mature and the new ones are sold to replace them. In 2026 alone, somewhere between $8 trillion and $10 trillion of Treasury debt has to be rolled over, and it's been refinanced at a far higher interest rate than it was first issued at. The average interest rate on the debt has already jumped to around 3.4%, up from around 1.4% at the start of 2022, nearly doubling in 4 years. Every basis point that Warsh adds gets baked into trillions of freshly issued debt, and the CBO has run the numbers. Every 0.1% increase in rates across the curve adds roughly $351 billion to the deficit over the following decade, which means a single full percentage point of hikes piles on around $3.5 trillion in extra interest. So, if Warsh hikes to kill inflation, he blows a hole in the entire budget. And by the way, if you want to keep track of stories like this that affect your paycheck, portfolio, and pension, then you should check out the Finance Bureau newsletter. It's absolutely free, and we break down the latest in the markets, monetary policy, macro, and more, so you never miss what really matters. Just click the link in the description or scan this QR code on the right of your screen to get started. Now, you might reasonably think that there's an obvious escape here. If hiking is so painful, why not simply cut rates, shrink the interest bill, and give the government some breathing room? On paper, that sounds sensible, but in reality, it's just the other jaw of the same trap, because the moment Warsh cuts into 4% inflation, that inflation roars straight back. Rate cuts are fuel on a fire that's already burning. And there's a second, nastier problem in the shape of the dollar. Because if the market decides the Fed is cutting simply to bail out the government's debt, confidence in the dollar cracks, and a weaker dollar makes everything America imports more expensive, which feeds straight back into inflation and completes the loop. And economists actually have a word for this exact scenario, guys, and it's called fiscal dominance, which is really just a fancy way of saying that the debt grows so large that it hijacks the central bank, so that the Fed stops setting rates based on what the economy needs and starts setting them based on what the government can afford. And there's a clear sign we're already drifting toward this, because the CBO projects that by 2031, the average interest rate on the debt will overtake the economy's growth rate. The textbook definition of a debt spiral, the point beyond which the debt compounds faster than the country can grow, and no amount of clever accounting can fix it. So, consider the corner that Warsh is painted into. Hike and the interest bill explodes. Cut and inflation and the dollar pay the price. He's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't, with no lever to pull that doesn't pile on the pain somewhere else. And that matters all the more because of who Kevin Warsh actually is. Sworn in as Fed chair in May 2026, Warsh is a hawk, and not a mild one. His personal philosophy can be summed up in a phrase he's found often repeating: inflation is a choice. He looks at the Fed's $6.7 trillion balance sheet, calls it bloated, and wants to shrink it. And he set up 5 separate task forces to take the institution apart and rebuild it with that balance sheet squarely in his crosshairs. And his first meeting told the whole story. Where the previous chair flooded markets with guidance, Warsh dramatically shortened the policy statement, refused even to submit his own rate forecasts on the grounds that it wasn't helpful, and he stripped out the forward guidance markets had leaned on for decades. He has, in effect, pulled the guardrails off, and the direction of travel is becoming clear. 9 officials on the committee now pencil in at least one rate hike this year, and markets are pricing in roughly a 2 in 3 chance of a hike as soon as September. So what you've got, guys, is a committed hawk whose entire instinct is to tighten and to shrink, responsible for the monetary policy of a nation sitting on a vast pile of debt, with his instincts pointing one way and the maths pointing the other. Shrinking that balance sheet carries its own hidden cost too, because when the Fed sells off its treasury holdings, it removes a massive reliable buyer from the market, and fewer buyers means the government has to offer more yields to shift the debt. So, the very act of cleaning up the Fed pushes borrowing costs higher independently of the actual rate decision. And that strain is already starting to show. At a recent Treasury auctions, primary dealers have been forced to absorb a larger than normal slice of new debt, a sign that private appetite for lending to the US government is softening. It's what makes Warsh's term so high stakes. A man with strong instincts handed a situation in which following those instincts might light the fuse. And this may perhaps sound like stuff for economists and politicians to worry about, but whichever way Warsh turns, the effects will hit ordinary people hardest. Take mortgages, for example. The 30-year fixed rate is already sitting at around 6.5%. and it tracks the 10-year Treasury yield, which is currently sitting at about 4.44%. So if Warsh hikes, or if his balance sheet plan pushes long yields higher, that rate climbs towards 7% and beyond. And if instead he cuts and inflation roars back, then people's purchasing power gets eaten alive. Either way, with the median American home now costing a record $429,000, affordability stays crushed. Savings actually also sit in the same bind. High-yield savings accounts are currently paying about 4 to 5%, which looks like a win, until you remember that with inflation at 4%, the real return is close to nothing. So, savers are running just to stand still. And if Warsh is forced to cut to rescue the government's books, that yield vanishes while inflation keeps eating away. And then there's pensions, which is where things get really dicey. The S&P 500 is now trading at an all-time high of around 7,450, but under the hood, chip stocks alone now make up a record 19.7% of the entire index. So a single trade, AI, has effectively become the market, and valuations are stretched to levels last seen at the peak of the dot-com bubble in 1999. Those long-duration growth stocks are the most sensitive things on earth to interest rate rises. So, if Warsh hikes, the discount rate on all future AI profits jumps, and the most crowded trade in modern history reprices hard. If you hold an index fund, a 401k, a workplace pension, you didn't choose that concentration. It simply arrived in your account, and it can leave in the same way. Meanwhile, American households are already stretched thin, carrying a record $18.8 trillion in debt, with credit card delinquencies at their highest rates since 2010. So the cushion isn't there, and whichever jaw of the trap closes, ordinary people feel it first. So there are no easy answers when it comes to this looming mountain of debt, only trade-offs that hurt real people either way. The Fed may seem like some all-powerful entity with the ability to wave its magic wand and make these problems go away. But in fact, it's almost as impotent an onlooker as the rest of us. As for what to watch from here, 3 things will tell you which way the trap finally springs. The balance sheet task force findings due this autumn, which will reveal how aggressively Warsh really intends to drain the system. The September meeting, the first real test of whether the hawkish talk becomes action. And the inflation prints between now and then, because they'll effectively decide his hand for him. Let's hope he gets dealt some good cards. But what do you think? Is Warsh the disciplined fiscal hawk who really forces some fiscal reality on Washington, even if it stings on the way down? Or is he about to tighten and trigger the very crisis he's trying to avoid? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you want to understand how America buried itself under this mountain of debt in the first place, you can check out our video on that right over here. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. This is Nick, signing off.